No sign of him, my lord.
Except, you know, here, there, everywhere.
I'm Harry Potter.
Harry Potter. It's a big thing. The wildly successful books led to incredibly popular movies, which led to even more lucrative merchandising and currently runs 1/4 of Tumblr. Right up there with Star Wars, James Bond, and Lord of the Rings, it's one of the most popular and successful film franchises in history. And I love it. I'm a Hufflepuff. Sorry. Harry Potter is still a big name, even after... what? It's been 6 years since the last movie came out? 6? And almost 10 years since the last book was released. God, I'm old. The series and its many characters still loom large in popular culture. Or maybe at least nerd culture.
What the hell is a Hufflepuff?
I may live in like this sort of nerd bubble where I just assume that everyone knows exactly who Peter Pettigrew is. This is not necessarily the case. But Harry Potter is still a very popular name and franchise. It still has enough steam in that engine to fund a huge chunk of Universal Studios.
Wizarding World of Harry Potter, arriving at Universal Studios Hollywood.
It's also fueled by the author, who just can't help herself from feeding all of us baby birds with background info and new stories. But the movies did the duty of introducing the wide populace to this series, myself included, who saw the first 2 movies before I started reading the books. So we are going to look at the subsequent Potter film series, the good, the bad, and the oddly paced. The first Harry Potter book, in my opinion, is one of the best works of modern fantasy fiction. Certainly one of the most popular children's books of all time, and everybody wanted to make these movies. And for those who complain about Chris Columbus and his questionable directing skills, it could have been a lot worse. And sorry, this isn't going to be a discussion of whether or not Chris Columbus is actually a good director, because sometimes yes and sometimes no. Steven Spielberg was interested at one point, and that doesn't sound too bad, but he actually wanted to Americanize the story and have Haley Joel Osment play Harry. Yeah. Also, there was Shyamalan.
So, are you the Avatar Ong?
At least director Chris Columbus knew that he was starting a franchise, and one that was based on an incredibly popular novel. And partly why he was chosen was because he was determined to adapt the books as closely as possible.
You need to be faithful.
Faithful to the book.
That we've been too faithful to the book.
I made a promise to her that we would be faithful to the book.
So for better or worse, his 2 films come off a bit slavish to the source material. Sure, Lord of the Rings came out around the same time, and it was pretty faithful as well, but even then, studios were more interested in making less films, not more. This also could have been the case with Harry Potter had they decided to cram multiple books into one movie. It could have happened. So because the first movie is so faithful to the source material, it ends up being fairly good at pleasing the fans and properly representing the characters. It also really well represents the world of the books. But as a film, it sacrifices a certain level of plot and pacing. That being said, the stuff that's in there that doesn't have much to do with the actual plot is just icing on the cake for the fans, and also works in the long run for giving the characters more dimension. One of the biggest reasons why everybody went and saw all of these movies is because you felt like you were growing up with the characters. Because you spent a lot of time with them. Especially in the first 2 films. You spent a lot of time with them. But kind of like the extended editions of Lord of the Rings, which I prefer, you should think of the first 2 movies as like a mini-series.
Oh no!
So the plot of the first movie is bad guy wants the MacGuffin, the Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone. Apparently Americans are just really turned off by philosophy, but sorcery, we're like all about that. And sure, Voldemort getting the stone is bad, but in the first movie, Voldemort still isn't really all that defined as a character. And the guy we think is a bad guy the entire movie is just one big old MacGuffin. Wait, that's the wrong term. He's a red herring. But no one's life is really at stake, or at least it doesn't feel like it really is. The plot works a lot better in the sequel because people are actually getting taken out like they're guests in a murder mystery party.
A red herring.
Also in Chamber of Secrets, it's a mystery because we don't know who's behind it all until the end. It's Voldemort. It's always Voldemort. So your enjoyment of the first movie kind of hinges on how well you enjoyed the characters and the world they inhabit. So Sorcerer's Stone is a flawed film, but it was a great setup for what was to come. More flawed films that I love. What? But before we move on, let's talk about those characters. All 3 million of them. Harry, Ron, and until you saw the movie for the first time and realized you had been pronouncing it wrong, Hermione. J.K. Rowling said she knew from the start that being a movie, the main characters would have to adapt to that medium.
But, you know, to be honest, you and Rupert and Emma are all too good looking.
So that stuff aside, I'm gonna try not to talk about how Hermione's hair isn't bushy enough and Ron's not tall enough. No, don't talk about that. That's another video. The three main actors do a very valiant job at establishing their characters. Hermione is nerdy and bossy, got it. Ron is brash and has issues. And Harry is a blank slate who just constantly asks questions.
The what? I'm a what? It's in there, Hagrid. Can I borrow this?
But the big thing is that they all come off as likable. I say that despite the fact that they all had very little acting experience before this movie, and it shows. Essentially, Chris Columbus had to feed them dialogue and ran 3 cameras at once so as to get more choices and performance levels. But it's an easy enough formula. Harry asks questions.
Can you hear me?
Hermione knows everything. And Ron says bloody hell.
Bloody hell!
Bloody hell! Bloody hell, Harry! Bloody hell!
Oh, bloody hell.
While the pacing and acting can bring it down, pretty much everything else redeems this movie. The first 2 movies paint this beautiful, warm fantasy world that any kid would love to inhabit. And now can. But it's the impressive sets, the gorgeous production design, practically every damn credible British actor playing a bit part, and John Williams' fantastic freaking score. Chamber of Secrets for me is where things start to get more interesting. Like I said, we've got a lot more of an active plot going on, a mystery where we don't know who's behind it. It's Voldemort, don't tell anybody. Because by this time we haven't gotten a clue that it's always going to be Voldemort. Yeah, but before that, I almost got the sense that the movies would be more episodic in their choice of bad guy. I mean, in the first movie, we definitely sensed that Voldemort thing will come back. But part 2 really puts a stamp on it. It's always Voldemort. And it was really with part 2 that I realized that this series was going somewhere. That it would have a definitive end. But very similarly to Sorcerer's Stone, Chamber of Secrets has a lot of stuff that could be cut out as well. I mean, this is a long movie, and it's not exactly enchanting me with its film work. Oh, but just you wait. The point here being that Chris Columbus could be a little bit too precious with the source material, in a way that Alfonso Cuarón was not. One thing that Chris Columbus did do well was make sure that the movie had an impeccable cast. Or maybe I should be thanking the casting director. I don't know, just shout out to the movie in general. Like I said before, there were early rumors of making this thing more American until J.K. Rowling probably put her foot down and said nope. But Columbus had sense enough to make this thing exclusively British. J.K. Rowling herself even had some say in the casting, voicing that Robbie Coltrane was her first choice to play Hagrid, and Alan Rickman her first choice to play Snape. Although I think she was thinking of like 1980s Alan Rickman, because I'm pretty sure Snape in the books is like in his mid-30s, and Alan Rickman was not. Rickman in particular has been heralded as one of the best casting choices in this entire series, even if he is a touch different in the book. Don't get me wrong, I love me some Alan Rickman, but if anything, Alan Rickman makes Snape way more likable. I mean, like, Snape in the book is a douche, but Alan Rickman plays him as much more of a lovable douche. Aw, see, look at him with lovable curmudgeon. Even when Rickman is at his most diabolical, he's still likable. While some characters fit completely perfectly into their roles. By the way, Gary Oldman is perfect in these movies in every possible way, and I love him more than life itself. Everyone at least pulls off making a strong impression. Well, almost everyone.
Let the feast begin.
Welcome. Oh, do get on with it!
I kind of get the feeling that because the filmmakers weren't exactly sure where the series was going, they couldn't foresee the importance that Dumbledore would play in the future of the series. So in the movie, his character is mostly exposition guy.
Yes, I know.
And it seems like Richard Harris might have touch been cast because, well, he's distinguished and old.
Milking it. Back.
Dumbledore, by the end of the whole series, turns out to be one of the most interesting characters, part and part from his mysterious backstory, and also he's a total badass. A badass who is very unassuming in a whimsical way.
Naturally.
But instead of eccentric and kooky, he just kind of feels really old.
On Lord of the Rings, they had chocolate hobnobs.
Back to witches and wizards and magical beasts, to goblins and ghosts.
Chamber of Secrets was a success, which proved that the series actually had legs, and the first movie wasn't just a fluke that was cashing in on the popularity of a really, really popular book. The books were still coming out as the movies were being made, and it was only gathering in popularity. So people still wanted to see these damn things adapted. However, Chris Columbus, after working on 2 giant films back to back, found that he was exhausted, shocking, and would not be carrying on to do any more, even though he said he originally assumed he would do all 7. Really, Chris? Really? That Chris Columbus and his dedication to being a good dad, what a weirdo. And the studio could have played it safe. They could have gotten some work-for-hire director like Brett Ratner, God forbid, to just come in and do what he was told, but nope. They hired the guy who made this. Whether it was because it was a different time and the studio was willing to take more risks, or they were just like, YOLO, it's not like we'll probably finish this thing. If Columbus had stayed on, there's a very good chance that the films would have grown stagnant. Still, it's one thing to hire a guy who has had some family blockbusters under his belt, and another thing to hire the guy who made this. And right away, it's like, whoa, handheld camera, long, weird, complicated camera moves. This feels different, and the darkness, it's here. To be fair, I thought things started to get dark right from part 2. I mean, we got spiders and snakes and creepy dungeons underneath haunted bathrooms. But there's definitely some warmth in the first 2 movies, and the third movie definitely leans harder into that teen hot topic aesthetic. I mean, does this make you think of anything else?
I am the shadow on the moon at night.
There you go. Prisoner of Azkaban is also a colder film, like it's supposed to be the end of summer and all you people are wearing jackets. But don't get me wrong, this is probably the best movie. At least the best adaptation. Where the first 2 tried so very freaking hard to get everything from the books in there, and it shows, Prisoner of Azkaban makes it look kind of easy. This is also where we start to get into the more complicated emotions of the characters. It's not just, oh, defeat the bad guy because he's bad. First it's get the bad guy because revenge, then realizing the bad guy's not really a bad guy.
Wait! I did my waiting! 12 years of it! In Azkaban!
And Harry learns that revenge kind of turns you into a monster. The first 2 movies' narratives are essentially about Harry learning that he is more capable than he thinks he is. Because he's a damaged, tortured puppy who's been told he's worthless his whole life. And in Prisoner of Azkaban, he's learning a lot more complicated lessons, like how revenge can turn you into kind of a monster. This guy's a rat. Symbolism. One of the biggest cuts from the book is a ton of backstory that gets dumped in this scene. And I mean, fans complained about all that was left out, but the fact that they shortened it to the length that they did and it still works is pretty dang impressive. It's a shout out to Steve Kloves. Cloves? Clove. And then the last half hour turns into Back to the Future Part 2. And introducing time travel is a big risk, man. It's so big that JK had to write herself out a few books later in a way that was really obvious. Side note, Prisoner of Azkaban also gets points for being the only movie where they got Harry's hair right. Alfonso Cuarón is also like a director with style who uses the medium of film and all of its powers of cinematography, editing, music to tell a story and convey emotions, whereas Chris Columbus, I mean, he sure adapted those books pretty accurately. One of Chris Columbus's biggest influences is director David Lean, and I kind of get that what he gleams from Lean is a certain aesthetic and mood and not really a style of filmmaking. I mean, Chris Columbus can't help it. I mean, no one else who directed a Harry Potter film ever made a freaking game changer like Children of Men. And this also makes Azkaban the most influential in our era of franchises. At least successful ones. Azkaban took risks with a filmmaker who made a sequel in a franchise his own distinct and wonderful movie, elevating it from just another episode, and it's why this movie is so much more belovedly remembered. Other studios like Marvel took a big page from this book in hiring filmmakers with more distinct voices, although now that seems to be over. Cause why change when you can have a bland formula that just prints money, right? The first few Harry Potter films may not be the best in the series, well, except for Prisoner of Azkaban, but they very brilliantly laid the groundwork for a series that would stretch over 10 years. The first 2 captured the hearts of kids who loved the books, and the third one cemented that this series could grow and evolve and become a strong force outside of the books. So the fact that this whole Harry Potter phenomenon just keeps going is largely due to the strength of the movies. So even kids who don't read can feel included too. And also, Warner Brothers can make a lot of money.
Money, come on, honey.